Before we begin, if you love stories where the aristocracy hides monsters behind velvet curtains, where a single locked door could topple a kingdom, hit that like button, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe, because this story is about to get very, very dark. London, 1861. Fog thick enough to swallow a scream. A duke with a secret buried 3 floors beneath his estate, and a woman about to knock on his door who has no idea she is about to become the only person alive who can bring the entire British aristocracy to its knees. This is the story of Duke Alexander Ravensmoor, and this is the story of the woman he was never supposed to fall in love with. Before Eleanor Hartley ever set foot in Ravensmoor Hall, before the fog rolled over the Yorkshire moors and swallowed the carriage lamps whole, there was a room. It sat at the end of the west corridor of Ravensmoor Hall, behind a door of black oak reinforced with iron bands that had no business being on a bedroom door. The servants did not speak of it. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, had worked at the hall for 11 years and had been inside that room exactly once, the night the old Duke died, and she had never spoken of what she saw there, not even in her prayers. The new Duke, Alexander Ravensmoor, kept the key to that room on a chain beneath his shirt, against his skin, day and night. He had inherited the title at 26. He had inherited the debts, the estate, the seat in the House of Lords, and he had inherited the secret. Nobody, not the Queen's ministers, not the whispering Lords of Parliament, not the newspapers that occasionally speculated about the tragic and mysterious Ravensmoor family, knew what was behind that door. But someone was about to find out, and it would not be by accident. 3 floors below the hall's grand staircase, in a chamber lined with ledgers no living clerk had ever been permitted to catalogue, lay proof of something so dangerous that 2 men had already died to keep it silent, though the world believed both deaths natural and the world was wrong. This is where our story begins. Not with Eleanor Hartley's carriage arriving at the gates of Ravensmoor Hall, though that will come soon enough, but with a single candle, guttering in a locked room, and a truth that had been waiting 11 years for someone willing to ask the wrong question. Yorkshire, October 1861. The interview had been arranged by Lady Constance Pembroke, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who considered romance a scheduling problem and marriage its solution. The Duke of Ravensmoor needed a fortune. The Hartley family, new money, mill money, Manchester money, had a daughter of considerable wealth and considerable poise. The geography was convenient. The timing was practical. Lady Pembroke had spent 30 years turning impractical people into practical couples, and she saw no reason this should be different. She had not, it must be said, consulted either party about their feelings on the matter. Eleanor Hartley arrived at Ravensmoor Hall on a gray Tuesday morning, her father beside her, her spine straight as a ruler. The carriage climbed the long approach road through a mist that clung to the moor grass like something unwilling to let go, and the hall itself rose out of that mist gradually, first the chimneys, then the black slate roof, then the long gray face of the building itself, windows dark even at 11 in the morning, as though the house itself preferred not to be looked at too closely. She wore a deep burgundy traveling dress, the kind of fabric that said money without saying new money, though new money was precisely what it was. She did not feel the need to apologize for that. She had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone in the north of England had. The Duke of Ravensmoor's first wife, Lady Margaret, had died 2 years prior, supposedly of a fever, though the servants' gossip that traveled faster than any newspaper suggested otherwise. Some said she had gone mad. Some said there had been no funeral anyone could recall attending, no grave anyone could point to in the family plot. Eleanor did not put much stock in servants' gossip. She would come to regret that dismissal. The Duke appeared at 11 o'clock precisely. He was taller than she expected, and, this she would never admit aloud, better looking than she had been warned. But it was his eyes that unsettled her. Gray, guarded, the eyes of a man who had already decided what he thought of the world, and did not expect the world to argue back. He moved through the drawing room the way a man moves through a house he no longer entirely trusts, alert to corners, careful with doors. "Miss Hartley," he said. "Your Grace," she replied. Her father and Lady Pembroke arranged themselves at the far end of the drawing room with the transparent subtlety of people who believed themselves invisible. The Duke glanced at this arrangement, then at her. "Perhaps we might speak privately," he said. "I find social performance a waste of both our time." They were shown to the library. It was, she noted, a very good library. The spines of the books were broken in from actual reading, not merely displayed for effect. Volumes on estate law beside volumes on continental history, and, she noticed this, and set it aside without understanding why it mattered yet, an entire shelf devoted to the peerage and the laws of succession, thick with paper markers. This she filed away as a point in his favor, and a point of quiet curiosity, one of the very few impressions she would carry out of that room with any warmth attached. "I will be direct," the Duke said, once they were seated. "My requirements are not complicated. I require a wife of sufficient fortune to address certain obligations concerning the estate. A woman capable of managing a household of this size and representing the Ravensmoor name in society." Hote. He paused, and something crossed behind his eyes that she could not name. "I require a wife who understands her place, who will not ask questions she has not been invited to ask." The silence that followed had weight to it. "You have been married before," Eleanor said quietly. His jaw tightened. "Yes. And your first wife asked questions she had not been invited to ask." The pause this time stretched long enough to mean everything. "She did," he said, "and it cost her dearly." Eleanor looked at the fire. She looked at the well-read books, the shelf on succession law that seemed suddenly less incidental. She looked at the man across from her, who had walked into this interview carrying a wound dressed up as a policy, and had just confessed the shape of that wound without realizing he had done it. She stood. "Thank you for your candor, Your Grace." She dropped into a curtsy, precise, correct, and utterly final. The kind of curtsy that said, "I see exactly what you are hiding, and I choose not to be part of it." Then she collected her father and left Ravensmoor Hall before Lady Pembroke had fully registered what had happened. "Well," her father said, once they were through the gates and the hall had disappeared behind the fog, "that went poorly." "He does not want a wife," Eleanor said. "He wants a woman who will not notice what he's hiding in that house." Her father, who had spent 26 years learning to read his daughter's silences, said nothing for a long moment. The carriage rattled on through the fog, past hedgerows and stone walls and the occasional startled sheep, and the hall's black chimneys sank slowly out of view behind them. "What will you do?" Eleanor looked at the moor rolling past the carriage window. "I have been considering the Ashcombe estate," she said. "It borders Ravensmoor land." Her father sighed the sigh of a man who understood exactly what his daughter's business decisions usually concealed. Before Ashcombe, before the boundary dispute that would change everything, there was London. And it is worth pausing here, in the weeks between the failed interview and Eleanor's decision, to understand exactly what kind of woman had just walked out of a duke's library without a second thought. George Hartley's fortune had not come from land or title. It had come from cotton, mills in Manchester that ran through the night, ledgers that Eleanor had read since she was 12 years old, sitting at her father's elbow while other girls her age were taught embroidery. He had no sons. He had decided, with the same practicality he applied to every mill contract, that his daughter would either be a liability to the family business or its greatest asset, and he had spent 14 years making certain it was the latter. They had come down to London that November on business, a contract with a shipping concern, nothing remarkable, and Eleanor found herself walking with her father through streets thick with a fog so total it swallowed gas lamps whole, turning them into pale smudges of orange floating disembodied in the gray. Hansom cabs emerged from the mist like ghosts and vanished again just as quickly. Somewhere a bell was tolling, muffled and directionless. It was on one such evening, waiting outside a solicitor's office on a street near Lincoln's Inn, that Eleanor first noticed the man with the ring. He was unremarkable in every particular except one, a heavy gold signet ring on his right hand, bearing a crest she did not recognize. Not a family crest she had ever seen catalogued in any peerage, but something older, stranger, with a design that seemed to fold in on itself when she tried to look at it directly. He stood across the street in a doorway, apparently waiting for someone, and he was watching her father's solicitor's office with the particular stillness of a man who was not, in fact, waiting for anyone at all. She thought nothing of it at the time. London was full of strange men in doorways. It was only much later, months later, in Yorkshire, with a broken lock and a letter with no signature, that she would remember that ring, and the fog, and the stillness of that watching man, and understand that her path toward Ravensmoor Hall had likely never been as accidental as she believed. Her father, for his part, noticed only that his daughter had gone quiet. "You're thinking about the Duke," he said, as they climbed into their own cab. "I'm thinking," Eleanor said, "that a man who keeps an entire shelf on succession law in his private library is not merely managing an estate. He is managing something he is afraid of." Her father raised an eyebrow. "And you intend to find out what?" "I intend," she said, "to buy the land next to his and see what happens when a man who wants no questions is forced to answer several." Ashcombe was purchased in 3 weeks, unusually fast for any property transaction in Yorkshire, faster still for one involving 4,000 acres. Eleanor Hartley moved in by the second week of November with 3 carriages of household goods, a housekeeper from Manchester, and a determination that unsettled the entire county before she had even unpacked her trunks. The Duke of Ravensmoor learned of his new neighbor from his steward, delivered in the studiously neutral tone of a man reporting something he considered enormously significant while pretending otherwise. "Miss Hartley," the Duke repeated, "the mill owner's daughter." "The sale completed on the 9th, Your Grace." The Duke set down his ledger and looked out the south-facing window, toward the boundary line where a stand of ancient elms marked the edge of his land, and, now, the edge of hers. "Has the boundary survey been updated recently?" "Not since your father's time." "Have it done, before the month is out." His steward said nothing further, but noted, as stewards do, that the Duke looked toward that south window 3 more times before the estate review concluded, and that his hand, when he returned to the ledger, was not entirely steady. Eleanor spent her first weeks at Ashcombe walking every room, every field, every inch of frost-hardened ground, with the methodical attention of a woman taking inventory of a war she intended to win. The estate had been neglected. The drainage in the lower fields had failed. 2 tenant cottages needed repairs long overdue. The county noticed all of this. Yorkshire, like any prosperous rural county close enough to matter, always noticed the interesting. She noted all of it. She had a plan by Thursday. On Friday morning, in her riding habit, she went to look at the boundary. The elms stood old and certain along the property line, and beyond them, Ravensmoor land stretched flat and gray under a sky that could not decide whether to rain. She heard the horse before she saw it, a black stallion, ridden hard, coming from the Ravensmoor side with the deliberate purpose of a man who had known exactly where to find her. He pulled up at the boundary and looked at her across it. "Miss Hartley, Your Grace." She did not curtsy. They stood in a frozen field. The curtsy had been for libraries. "I see you've wasted no time." "I have wasted none," she agreed. "The estate required attention." "The boundary survey," he said. "My steward tells me you've engaged a surveyor." "I have. So have I." The wind moved through the bare elm branches above them, and for a long moment neither spoke. "Then we shall have 2 surveys," Eleanor said finally. "And they will either agree, in which case the matter is simple, or they will not, in which case the matter becomes interesting." Something shifted behind the Duke's guarded expression, something less managed, less rehearsed. "You are very direct, Miss Hartley." "You told me you valued directness, Your Grace. In the library. I took you at your word." He studied her for a long moment, the stallion shifting restlessly beneath him. "The lower fields," he said finally. "The drainage repair. It will require access across Ravensmoor Lane." "I intended to write to your steward about it." "Write to me," he said, "directly." Then he turned the horse and rode back toward the gray shape of Ravensmoor Hall, rising out of the fog, leaving Eleanor at the boundary line with a phrase she would turn over in her mind for longer than she wanted to admit. The 2 surveys returned in December, and, as Eleanor had half expected, half hoped, they did not agree. According to the 1809 deed under which Ashcombe had been sold, the boundary ran 12 feet north of the elms. According to Ravensmoor's estate records, dating to 1740, it ran 12 feet south of them. 24 feet of disputed Yorkshire ground, claimed quietly by both families for over a century, had gone unchallenged simply because no one had ever cared enough to look. Eleanor cared enough to look. She wrote to the Duke. The letter took 2 drafts, the first too warm, the second precisely correct, proposing they review the surveys together at the boundary itself. His reply came the next morning, in his own hand rather than a secretary's. "Miss Hartley, I have reviewed both surveys. The discrepancy is clear. I propose Thursday next, 10 o'clock, at the Boundary. Bring the 1809 deed. I will bring the 1740 record. Ravensmoor. No pleasantries. No performative regret about the dispute. Just the time, the documents, and the unspoken expectation of her presence. Eleanor found this, against her better judgment, more compelling than any amount of florid courtesy could have been. Thursday was cold and sharp-edged in the way that made everything feel suddenly precise. She arrived at the Boundary at 5 minutes to 10. He was already there, on foot, the 1740 record in hand, his steward beside him. She had brought her own surveyor. Each of them noted what the other had brought, and understood exactly what it meant. They spread the documents on the flat stone of the old Boundary wall and argued, genuinely argued, with the precision of two people who were each entirely right and entirely incompatible, about precedent versus deed, about history versus law. You have done this before, the Duke said eventually, watching her dismantle his steward's argument point by point. Argued a boundary dispute. My father's business involves a considerable number of negotiations, Eleanor said. I have been present for most of them since I was 16. Your father involves you in his business. My father involves me in everything, she said. He has no sons. He has me. He decided when I was 12 that this was either a liability or an advantage, and has proceeded on the assumption of the latter. She met his gaze. He has not been wrong. The Duke looked at the two ancient elms standing in their disputed 24 feet with the serene indifference of trees that predated either family's claim to anything. I'm going to make you a proposal, he said. She waited. The disputed strip has no practical use to either estate beyond the drainage ditch that runs through it. I propose we agree to a shared boundary at its center, 12 feet to each side, recorded formally, and a joint maintenance arrangement for the ditch. You have a century of precedent, Eleanor said. You could contest this in court and very likely win. I could. Why don't you? He looked toward the elms. Because it would take 18 months, cost both estates a great deal, and at the end of it, one of us would have 24 feet of land and the other would have a grievance, and we are going to be neighbors for a very long time. I prefer functional neighbors to legal victories. Eleanor looked at the documents. She looked at the man who had just offered her a fair and reasonable settlement instead of the crushing legal advantage he actually possessed, the kind of offer a man makes when he has decided, quietly, that he respects the person across from him more than he respects winning. I accept, she said, on the condition the formal record reflects the legal basis, not merely the historical one. He was quiet a moment. Agreed. She extended her hand across the wall. He looked at it, the hand of a woman who worked her own estate, gloved but worn at the thumb from her own pen, and shook it with the brief, firm grip of a man who meant precisely what he agreed to. Neither of them mentioned that this had been the second time in 3 months he had chosen honesty with her over the comfortable distance of his title. It was Mrs. Pruitt, the Ravensmoor housekeeper, who first mentioned the locked door to Eleanor. Not deliberately, but in the accidental way that long-held secrets sometimes slip loose when the person carrying them is simply, finally, exhausted. It happened in January, at a county dinner hosted by Lady Pembroke, where the Duke and Eleanor found themselves, quite by design, on Lady Pembroke's part, seated near one another for the third time that winter. The dinner had drawn the full breadth of county society, the Aldertons, the Fenwicks, a scattering of minor gentry eager to observe whatever was developing between the Duke and his new neighbor. Candlelight glowed warm against dark oak paneling, and the conversation moved in its familiar seasonal circuits, the harvest, the roads, the coming London season. During a lull, while the Duke was occupied at the far end of the table, Mrs. Pruitt, who had accompanied him as part of the household staff attending to the evening, found herself briefly alone with Eleanor near the window. You're good for him, Miss Hartley, the older woman said, quiet enough not to carry. Whatever anyone says about the Ravensmoor name, he hasn't smiled, not truly, since before the West Corridor was sealed. Eleanor kept her expression carefully neutral. The West Corridor? Mrs. Pruitt's face changed, the sudden, stricken look of a woman who has said too much. Her hand went briefly to the small crucifix at her throat. It's nothing, miss. An old wing, not used. She excused herself before Eleanor could ask another question, moving away with the brisk, over-careful steps of someone putting distance between herself and a mistake. But Eleanor Hartley did not forget things easily, and she did not forget this. She thought of it again in February, when the Duke arrived unannounced at Ashcombe, not by letter, but in person, on foot, to look at the drainage ditch himself rather than send his steward. "I thought a look at the ditch would be more useful than a letter," he said. "It would," she agreed, and led him out into the frost. They walked the length of the ditch together, breath fogging in the cold, and he asked 2 questions that proved he understood the drainage problem, and a third that proved he'd already worked out the solution. His coat was practical, not fashionable. And for the first time, Eleanor found herself studying him not as an adversary or a business complication, but as a man, one who had come himself, in the cold, without being asked twice. "Why did you come yourself?" she asked. "I told you to write to me directly," he said. "That implies the same in return." They took tea afterward in her library, and talked of drainage, and then of the county road bill, and then, carefully, both of them dancing around it, of nothing important at all, which was itself a kind of intimacy neither had expected to want. It was as she poured a second cup that she finally asked the question she had been circling for a month. "Your Grace, what is the West Corridor?" The teacup stopped halfway to his lips. The silence that followed was unlike any silence that had passed between them before. Not the comfortable quiet of 2 people working, but something colder, something that made the fire in the grate seem suddenly very far away. His knuckles had gone white around the cup. "Where did you hear that name?" His voice had dropped into a register she had not heard from him before, not cold exactly, but frightened in a way he was trying very hard to disguise as cold. "Mrs. Pruitt mentioned it. By accident, I think." He set the cup down with exaggerated care, as though his hands required conscious instruction to move slowly. "It is not a subject I discuss, Miss Hartley. You discuss the drainage of my south field without hesitation, and yet a corridor in your own house is forbidden ground? Some ground," he said quietly, "is forbidden for reasons that have nothing to do with hesitation, and everything to do with protecting people who do not deserve to be dragged into it." He left shortly after, more abruptly than any previous visit, and Eleanor stood at her library window watching his carriage disappear into the darkening lane, aware, with the precise, uncomfortable clarity she brought to all important information, that she had just touched something far larger than a family scandal. Lady Pembroke's late winter connections extended, as they always had, considerably further than Yorkshire. In March, an invitation arrived at both Ashcombe and Ravensmoor Hall for a garden reception at a townhouse near St. James's, nominally hosted by a minor cousin of the Queen's household, in practice a gathering where half the peerage of England would circulate beneath ornamental orange trees, taking the measure of one another's fortunes and marriages and futures. Eleanor had not intended to attend, but her father's business interests had grown, over the winter, entangled enough with government contracts that his presence was expected, and where her father went, increasingly, Eleanor went also. The garden, heated by braziers against the March chill, hung with lanterns that turned the fog rolling faintly off the Thames into something almost beautiful, was exactly as she expected, a slow, glittering current of silk and metals and careful conversation. She spotted the Duke almost immediately, engaged near the orangery with 2 older men whose bearing suggested government rather than land. It was there, moving between clusters of guests with a glass of watered wine she had no intention of finishing, that Eleanor saw the ring again. The same gentleman from the fog-bound street near Lincoln's Inn stood near the garden's far wall, in conversation with no one, watching, as before, with a stillness that did not belong at a party. He wore evening dress indistinguishable from 100 other men present. Only the ring marked him, heavy gold, that strange folding crest. She was still considering whether to approach him when Lady Pembroke appeared at her elbow, following her gaze. "Ah," Lady Pembroke said, her voice dropping to something Eleanor had never heard from her, genuine unease. "You've noticed Mr. Aldrich Vane. You know him?" "I know of him," Lady Pembroke said. "He is spoken of, when he is spoken of at all, as a man who serves interests considerably above his apparent station. Some say the Home Office. Some say older interests still, men who have made it their business, for generations, to know what the Crown would prefer remain unknown." She took a slow breath. "He was seen in Yorkshire in the autumn, Miss Hartley, around the time Lady Margaret Ravensmoor supposedly died." Eleanor's grip on her glass did not change, though everything in her had gone very still. Supposedly. There was no grave anyone attended, Lady Pembroke said quietly. I have wondered about it for 2 years and never had the nerve to ask the Duke directly. I would advise you to consider carefully before you develop the nerve yourself. Across the garden, the Duke had gone rigid. Eleanor saw it even at a distance, the sudden change in his posture, as his gaze found Aldrich Vane's. For one long moment, the two men looked at each other across the crowded lawn, and whatever passed between them contained none of the polite indifference of strangers. Vane inclined his head, a small, precise gesture, almost a bow, almost a warning, and turned and walked unhurried toward the garden gate, and was gone into the fog beyond the lanterns, before the Duke could cross the lawn to intercept him. The Duke reached Eleanor's side moments later, his composure visibly reassembled, though his eyes kept flicking toward the gate. You know that man, Eleanor said. It was not a question. I know what he represents, the Duke said, which is considerably more dangerous than knowing the man himself. He was in London in November, Eleanor said, watching my father's solicitor's office. Something behind the Duke's guarded expression cracked, just slightly, the first true fear she had seen in him. Then, they have known about you, he said quietly, considerably longer than I realized. March also brought the first county assembly of the season back in Yorkshire, and with it 40 guests, a great deal of wine, and Lord Cassian Ashby, a baronet of considerable self-regard who had never once revised an opinion in his life and considered this a virtue. Eleanor had learned over the winter that wherever the Duke went, Ashby followed, with the gravitational loyalty of a man who mistook proximity to a title for equivalence to it. And she had learned, more importantly, that Ashby did not care for how quickly the county had come to respect the mill owner's daughter. He found his moment near the end of the evening, with 4 people conveniently within earshot. Miss Hartley, Ashcombe is looking remarkably improved, I hear. Extensive investment for a property so newly acquired. A pause, timed for effect. One does wonder whether such spending is proportionate to the likely tenure of the investment. The word tenure did exactly the work he had built it to do. In another mouth, harmless. In his, with his pause and his audience, it meant, you are new money among old families, and everyone here knows it. Eleanor was composing her reply. She had given variations of it in Manchester boardrooms a dozen times, when a voice cut in from her right. The improvements at Ashcombe, the Duke said, in a tone she had never heard from him before. Not the library voice, not the boundary wall voice, but something underneath both of them, carrying the full weight of 200 years of the Ravensmoor name, include a drainage redesign that has resolved a flooding problem affecting both the Ashcombe and Ravensmoor estates for 30 years. The investment is entirely proportionate, as anyone genuinely familiar with the land would know. Ashby's smile underwent a rapid, humiliating recalibration. Of course, I merely, the county, the Duke continued, with the economy of a man who requires no volume to be obeyed, benefits from landowners who take their responsibilities seriously. I believe we are all agreed on that. He held Ashby's gaze one moment longer than necessary, the aristocratic equivalent of a slammed door, then returned to his previous conversation as though nothing at all had happened. Ashby found someone else to speak to with considerable haste. Eleanor stood in the aftermath, turning the moment over with the same care she gave to contracts. She was not a woman who required protection. She had never needed it, and would never need it. But she understood, standing there, that there was a difference between needing a champion and being able to receive one without it costing her anything of herself. She crossed the room to where Lady Pembroke stood observing with poorly disguised satisfaction. He intervened, Eleanor said. I saw, said Lady Pembroke. He did not have to. No, Eleanor agreed. He did not. 3 days after the assembly, the Duke called at Ashcombe on foot, unannounced, and waited at her gate until she crossed the field to meet him. His face, in the pale afternoon light, looked as though he had not slept. I owe you an apology, he said, before she had even reached him. In October, what I said, the manner in which I said it, was not how I should have spoken to you. I came to that interview with a position already formed, one that had nothing to do with you, and everything to do with... He stopped. Your first wife, Eleanor said quietly. Yes. He looked, finally, directly at her. And with the man you saw at the garden reception, I am not ready to tell you everything, Miss Hartley, but after what happened in London, I owe you enough of the truth that you understand exactly what you have walked into by buying the land next to mine." She opened the gate. "Come in. I believe I owe you tea, given how many times you've provided the reverse." They sat in her library, the same room where she worked every morning, papers and survey maps scattered across the desk between them. Outside, the light was already beginning to fail, though it was barely 4 o'clock, one of those gray Yorkshire afternoons that seem to skip dusk entirely and go straight to dark. "Margaret did not die of fever," he said finally, quietly, the words costing him visibly. "She is alive." Eleanor went very still. "She discovered something," the Duke continued, "in the archives of this family. A ledger my father kept, hidden behind the false wall of the West Corridor's inner chamber, that documented something no living peer of this realm is meant to know. A marriage, Miss Hartley. A secret marriage, contracted 3 generations ago, between a Ravensmoor daughter and a man whose bloodline, had it been formally recognized, would sit closer to the throne of England than the line currently seated upon it." He drew a breath that shook, very slightly, on its way out. "My family has spent 100 years and considerable fortune ensuring that ledger was never found, never proven, never spoken of. Because if it were, it would not merely disgrace the Ravensmoor name. It would call into question the legitimacy of the entire line of succession that has governed this country since before Waterloo." The fire cracked in the silence that followed. "Margaret found it," Eleanor said slowly. "She found it, and she did not understand, or did not care to understand, what finding it would cost her. She wanted to speak of it, to someone, anyone, Parliament, the newspapers. I do not know who she imagined would listen. I was afraid, for her, and I will not pretend otherwise, for myself and this family, of what would happen if she did. Men like Aldrich Vane exist for precisely this purpose, Miss Hartley, to ensure certain truths never reach certain ears. I had her removed to a private asylum in the north under an assumed name and told the world she had died, because the alternative, what Vane's people would have done to silence her permanently rather than merely quietly, was worse. The West Corridor is where you kept the ledger." "Yes," he said, "and 3 weeks ago, someone broke the lock." What the Duke told Eleanor next, he had told no one. Not his steward, not Mrs. Pruitt, not even, in its entirety, himself, if such a thing were possible for a man to withhold from his own conscience. Margaret Ravensmoor was not dead, and she was not mad. She was housed, comfortably, he insisted, though Eleanor heard the strain beneath the word, in a private establishment near Harrogate, under the name Mrs. Gray, attended by a physician paid handsomely for his discretion. She wrote to no one. She received no one. For 2 years, her existence had been reduced to 4 walls, a garden she was permitted to walk under supervision, and the particular, grinding loneliness of a woman erased from her own life by the husband who had once loved her. "You loved her," Eleanor said. "It was not quite a question." "I did," the Duke said. "I do. In whatever way a man can love a woman he has done this to. That is precisely why I have not been able to forgive myself, and precisely why I told you, in October, that I required a wife who would not ask questions. Because the last time a woman I loved asked the right question, I answered it by destroying her life to save my family's name. And some nights I am no longer certain the 2 things were as separable as I told myself they were." Eleanor sat with this for a long moment, the fire popping softly, the Yorkshire dark pressing at the windows. "I want to see her," she said finally. "Miss Hartley, I did not ask your permission, Your Grace. I informed you of my intention." She met his eyes with the same composure she had carried out of his library in October. If a broken lock means someone else already knows what Margaret found, then Margaret is no longer safe simply by being hidden. Hiding her worked when no one else was looking. Someone is looking now. He studied her for a long moment, the same complete, assessing attention she remembered from their first meeting, though it carried none of its original coldness now. "You are correct," he said slowly, "and I hate that you are correct, because it means I have been wrong about how to protect her for 2 years, and I do not know how to begin doing it differently." "Then we begin," Eleanor said, "by finding out exactly what she found. Because I suspect, Your Grace, that the only way to make a secret stop being dangerous is to make certain it is no longer a secret to the people who could actually do something about it." They traveled to Harrogate 2 days later, in a plain, unmarked carriage the Duke insisted upon, with no crest on the door and a driver he trusted enough to pay triple for his silence. Eleanor had expected, somehow, a grim place. Bars on windows, the sounds she associated with the word asylum from penny newspapers and overheard warnings. What she found instead was a handsome stone house set behind high walls and a well-tended garden, quiet as a country rectory, giving away nothing of what it contained. "She does not know I am coming," the Duke said, as they waited in a small, cold receiving room, while a nurse went to fetch the woman known there as Mrs. Gray. "I have not seen her in 8 months. I could not—" He stopped, and did not finish the sentence, and Eleanor did not ask him to. Margaret Ravensmoor, when she entered, was not what Eleanor expected either. She was younger than Eleanor had pictured, perhaps 30, with pale, composed features and eyes that carried none of the wildness the word mad had led Eleanor to imagine, only a deep, banked exhaustion, the look of a woman who had spent 2 years being disbelieved so thoroughly that she had largely stopped expecting to be believed at all. She stopped in the doorway when she saw the Duke, and her hand went, briefly, to the frame, as though she required it to remain standing. "Alexander," she said, her voice was steady. Eleanor noted, with the same careful attention she brought to every important detail, that there was no love left in the way Margaret said his name, but no hatred either. Only the flat, careful tone of a woman who had learned to feel as little as possible about the man who had put her here, because feeling anything at all had become too expensive to afford. Margaret. The Duke's own voice was not steady at all. "Who is this?" Margaret's gaze moved to Eleanor, sharp and assessing in a way that reminded Eleanor, uncomfortably, of the Duke himself on the day they had first met. "Eleanor Hartley," Eleanor said, before the Duke could answer for her. "I own the estate bordering Ravensmoor land. 3 weeks ago, someone broke into the room where your husband kept the ledger you found. I have come to ask you what was in it, because I believe you are the only person who can tell us exactly what we are now protecting you from." Something shifted in Margaret's expression. Not warmth, not yet, but the first flicker of something like respect, or perhaps simply relief at being addressed as a person capable of answering a direct question, after 2 years of no one asking her anything at all. "Sit down," Margaret said. "Both of you. This will take longer than a receiving room conversation allows, and I find I am finally, after 2 years, in a mood to say all of it." What followed took the better part of an hour, and Eleanor would remember every word of it for the rest of her life. The ledger, Margaret explained, had been kept by the 3rd Duke of Ravensmoor, Alexander's great-grandfather, and hidden not out of shame at its contents alone, but out of fear of what those contents implied about the stability of the entire peerage. It recorded, in the 3rd Duke's own careful hand, a marriage performed in 1789 between Lady Cordelia Ravensmoor, the Duke's own sister, and a man named only as F.H., a marriage that had been quietly annulled within the year by a private act that never reached public record, on grounds the ledger described only as matters of state, at His Majesty's own request. "The initials," Margaret said, "are not difficult to work out if you know the family histories the way I came to know them, sitting alone in that house for 2 years with nothing else to occupy my mind. F.H. was a natural son of a royal duke, one whose existence the crown has spent 70 years quietly ensuring the public never fully reckoned with. If that marriage had stood, if it had never been annulled, or if the annulment itself was improperly executed, which the ledger suggests it was, hastily done, and never properly recorded before witnesses of standing, then the line of succession that has governed this country since would rest on considerably less solid ground than anyone in Westminster would care to admit. You are saying," Eleanor said slowly, "that there may be a legitimate claim to the throne, dormant for 70 years, that no one currently in power knows exists." "I am saying," Margaret said, "that I found enough in that ledger to make several extremely powerful men in London decide it was safer to have me disappear than to have me finish reading it." She looked at the Duke. "Which is precisely what you did for them, Alexander, whether you intended it that way or not." The Duke said nothing. His hands, folded in his lap, were white-knuckled. "There is more," Margaret said quietly, turning back to Eleanor. "I did not read the entire ledger before Alexander's men came for me. There were pages, loose correspondence, tucked into the back, that I never had the chance to finish. Letters, I believe, naming the man who carried out the annulment on the crown's behalf. A name that would tell you exactly who has been protecting this secret for 70 years, and exactly who broke that lock 3 weeks ago to make certain it stayed protected a while longer. Do you remember the name? Eleanor asked. Margaret's composed exhaustion cracked, for just a moment, into something colder. I remember a signet ring, she said, sketched in the margin beside the name, as though whoever wrote it wanted it recognized rather than merely read. A strange crest, folded in on itself, like a knot. Eleanor felt the room go very still around her. Aldrich Vane, she said. Margaret's eyes sharpened. You've seen him. Twice, Eleanor said. Once in London, in the fog, outside my father's solicitor's office. Once at a garden reception near St. James's, 3 weeks ago. She looked at the Duke. The same 3 weeks the lock was broken. They left the stone house behind its high walls as the light was failing, Margaret's composed, exhausted voice still ringing in Eleanor's ears, and the unmarked carriage rattled south through lanes that grew darker and narrower as the last color drained out of the sky. The Duke sat across from her, silent, his eyes fixed on nothing, and Eleanor understood that he was somewhere else entirely, back in a room 2 years gone, watching a version of himself decide that silence was mercy. You did not ask her forgiveness, Eleanor said, some miles into the silence. I did not think I had earned the right to ask for it yet. He looked at her, finally, in the dim carriage light. I intend to, when there is something left to offer her, besides an apology, a name, a way to undo what I did, not merely regret it. The carriage slowed unexpectedly on a stretch of road running through close, overgrown hedgerow, the kind of lane where a farm cart might reasonably block the way, except there was no cart, only a single lantern set in the middle of the road, burning steadily in the windless dusk, and no one visible near it at all. The driver's voice came back to them, tight with unease. Your Grace, there's something in the road. The Duke's hand moved instinctively to Eleanor's arm, not quite touching her, a gesture of protection he seemed to catch himself making, and did not withdraw. Do not open the door, he said quietly. They sat in the stopped carriage, the single lantern burning ahead of them in the dark lane, for what felt like a very long time, and was likely no more than 30 seconds. Then, from the hedgerow to their left, a voice spoke, even, unhurried, entirely unsurprised to find them there. Your Grace, Miss Hartley, I had rather hoped we might speak before matters progressed any further. Eleanor did not need to see the ring to know the voice. Aldrich Vane stepped into the lantern light with the unhurried calm of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise his voice to be obeyed, his gold signet catching the low light as he rested one gloved hand against the carriage door. I am not here to harm either of you, Vane said, before the Duke could speak. If I wished you dead, Your Grace, Lady Margaret would have joined her supposed grave 2 years ago rather than a comfortable house in Harrogate. I have, in fact, gone to considerable trouble to ensure neither of you has come to any harm at all, which is rather more than I can say for the men I answer to, should they conclude you have become inconvenient. You broke the lock, the Duke said. I did, Vane agreed, entirely unbothered by the accusation, because I needed to know precisely how much of that ledger still existed before deciding whether it could remain buried or whether it had already grown too dangerous to leave in the hands of a duke who married a woman clever enough to find it once, and a second woman, I am beginning to suspect, considerably cleverer still. His eyes moved, deliberate and unhurried, to Eleanor. You have caused me a great deal of trouble, Miss Hartley, simply by being the kind of woman who does not stop asking a question once she has started. Then tell us what we are asking about, Eleanor said, and perhaps I will stop. Something that might, on a different man, have been the beginning of a smile crossed Vane's face. You already know what you are asking about, or you would not have brought Lady Margaret's name into a conversation at a garden party 3 weeks ago, loudly enough that it reached ears I would have preferred it never reached. He straightened, drawing his coat closer against the evening chill. I will tell you this much, freely, because I suspect it will not slow you down in the slightest, and because I have found, over a long career, that the truth frightens intelligent people considerably more effectively than a threat does. The ledger your wife found, Your Grace, is not merely a family embarrassment. It is the only surviving proof of a claim that, if pressed correctly before the right committee of the House of Lords, could force a formal inquiry into the legitimacy of the entire reigning line. I have spent 11 years ensuring that proof stayed buried. I did not break that lock to destroy it, Miss Hartley. He paused. I broke it because I needed to know whether it was still there at all, or whether someone had already removed it, for purposes considerably less patient than mine. The Duke went very still. It's gone. The main ledger remains, Vane said. The loose correspondence tucked into its back cover, the letters your wife never finished reading, the ones naming the man who performed the annulment. Those pages are missing, Your Grace. Removed sometime in the last 3 weeks by someone who knew exactly where to look and who did not leave so much as a broken hinge as a courtesy to whoever might come looking after them. He stepped back from the carriage, into the dark of the hedgerow. Someone else wants this secret now, Vane said, and unlike me, I do not believe they intend to keep it buried. I would suggest, Your Grace, Miss Hartley, that you return to Ravensmoor Hall considerably faster than you had planned, and that you go directly to the west corridor the moment you arrive, and pray, for all our sakes, that whoever took those pages has not yet finished with the room they took them from. He was gone into the hedgerow before either of them could answer, swallowed by the dark as completely as if the lane had simply closed over him, and the single lantern in the road guttered out a moment later, as though someone's hand had reached out and pinched the flame between 2 fingers. The Duke rapped on the carriage roof. Drive, he said, fast as the road allows. Ravensmoor, now. They reached Ravensmoor Hall well past midnight, the carriage horses lathered and blowing hard, through fog thick enough to swallow the carriage lamps whole. Vane's words had followed them the entire way, and neither the Duke nor Eleanor had spoken more than a handful of sentences during the drive, both of them straining, uselessly, to hear anything on the dark road behind them that might explain who had gotten to the ledger before they had. The Duke led her through the hall's cold, echoing corridors, past portraits of Ravensmoor ancestors whose painted eyes seemed, in the flickering candlelight the footmen carried ahead of them, to follow rather more closely than portraits ought to the west wing, and the black oak door with its iron bands. The lock hung broken from the frame, splintered wood around it where a crowbar, or something heavier, had been forced through. The Duke stood before it, and for the first time since Eleanor had known him, Alexander Ravensmoor looked afraid, not the composed, managed wariness she had come to recognize as his natural register, but something rawer, older, the fear of a man who has spent his whole life guarding a door and has just discovered the guarding was never enough. Someone knows, he said quietly. Someone beyond these walls knows what Margaret discovered, and if they act on it before I can protect her, before I can protect any of us. A sound came from deep within the corridor behind the broken door. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Not the Duke's, and not Eleanor's, and not, she realized with a cold drop in her stomach, the tread of any of the household staff she had come to recognize over 5 months of visits to this house. The footman's candlelight guttered, as though a draft had moved through the corridor from somewhere that should have had no draft at all. Your Grace, Eleanor said, very quietly, is there anyone else who should be inside that room? The Duke's hand moved, slowly, to the key still hanging on the chain beneath his shirt, the key to a lock that had already been broken, rendering it suddenly, uselessly symbolic. No, he said. There is not. The footsteps stopped. Somewhere beyond the broken door, in the dark, something, or someone, was standing very still and listening, exactly as they were. What Margaret Ravensmoor found in that ledger would not just end a marriage, or a household, or a single duke's reputation. It could unravel the entire line of the British throne, and now someone else wants it badly enough to break a locked door in the dead of night, and badly enough, perhaps, to already be standing on the other side of it, waiting. Who is behind that door? Is it Aldrich Vane, finally done watching from doorways and garden walls? Is it someone even closer to the crown than that? And what will Alexander Ravensmoor do now that the woman standing beside him in that corridor understands exactly what he has spent 2 years hiding and has already decided she isn't going to let him hide it any longer? That's where we'll pick this up next time. If you want to find out what's behind that door, and trust me, it changes everything, make sure you're subscribed because part 2 is coming. Drop a comment below with your theory on who's in that room. And if this story pulled you in, hit like right now. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like this one. Until next time.